Chapter 6 Intersubjective Magic. Part 1 Intrasubjective Magic. Since all magic that does not presuppose the intervention of demons is intersubjective, it is possible that the performer's action is directed to himself, in which case we have to deal with an intrasubjective magic. This branch of magic is particularly important, representing, to some extent, the propaedeutics of all the more advanced activities of the pneumatic art. Just as magic phenomena exist in nature, attraction by the magnet, to mention only the most common example, and in human society, the attraction of lovers, so also do born manipulators of magic exist, even though their field of action is reduced and not subject to control by the will. As a rule, however, with or without a natural gift, the magician becomes. And just as the student of psychoanalysis cannot practice without having first been analysed himself, so the magician able to practice his art has first practiced it on himself. Since magic in general is a spiritual function, the individual who practices it must have certain qualities lacking in most mortals. Indeed, insofar as mortals are concerned, the ethereal body, originally transparent and pure, has become opaque and thick through contact with the body. All the filth of matter has become encrusted on it, jeopardizing its primordial luminosity and flexibility. Now, since spirit is the vehicle of the soul, and the soul is the medium of liaison between the intellect and the natural world, this miraculous contact is broken as soon as the vehicle has become too slow to let the soul travel, or too dirty for the phantasmic messages transmitted by the soul to reach the inner sense. The pneuma is a mirror with two faces, one of which reflects perceptions coming from the external senses, and the other the phantasmagoria of the soul. If the surface turned towards the soul is not sufficiently clean, the individual is reduced to a lower, almost bestial state. What can be done to remedy this situation, common to most mortals? Well, nothing could be simpler. It is just a matter of polishing the mirror, removing its impurities, acquired, not congenital, restoring to the clouded spirit its original transparency, as well as its purity, flexibility, and hardness. Quote, "For spirit is the intermediary between the gross body of the world and the soul. In it and through it there are stars and demons. Man draws from it through his own spirit, which conforms to the other by virtue of its nature. But that can be done mainly if the spirit, thanks to art, is made more compatible with the spirit of the world, namely, more heavenly. It becomes heavenly if it is scrupulously purged of its filth and everything tainted by it, purged of everything dissimilar to its heavenly essence. It must be taken into consideration not only that food entering the viscera dirties the spirit, but that the stains are often caused by the soul, by the skin, by clothing, lodgings, and the surrounding air." Unquote. It is easy to comprehend that Ficino's novice must submit to rigorous discipline to keep his distance from all that could contaminate and infect his pneuma. He is required not only to observe a very strict diet, but also to practice purifications, to be careful of the cleanliness of his person, his clothing, his house, to choose the route for his walks, the people he sees, the things he talks to them about, and of course to cultivate virtues. Of all these procedures, whose purpose is the expurgatio a sordibus, the purging of filth, are accompanied by more specific external methods. Quote, First, the spirit must be purified by sufficient medicines to remove the vapours that becloud it. Second, its luminosity must be restored by shiny things. Third, it must be treated in such a way as to make it more subtle and harder, and it will become celestial to the highest degree if it is much exposed to the influence of rays, and above all to the influence of the sun, which is dominant among celestial things. End quote. Among the 7 planets of the so-called Chaldean series, Moon, Mercury, Venus, Sun, Mars, Jupiter, Saturn, there are those which are especially beneficent, Sun, Jupiter, Venus, called by Ficino the 3 Graces. Their influences, as well as the influence of Mercury, are fundamentally important to the purging of the Pneuma. We already know that there are series of objects classified according to their planetary affiliation. When it is impossible to expose oneself directly to the rays of the beneficent planets, it will suffice to make use of them. To acquire the solarization of the spirit, for instance, one must observe a healthy diet, take walks in loci amoeni, in pure and mild air filled with light and the perfume of plants, but also to use substances such as wine and sugar, plants, metals, and precious solar or Jovian stones. Quote, "When our spirit has been carefully prepared and purged by natural things, it is able to receive many gifts through stellar rays from the spirit of cosmic life. Cosmic life is visibly propagated in trees and grasses, which are like the hair of the body of the earth, and it is also revealed in stones and metals, which are like the teeth and bones of the body. It circulates in the living shells of the earth, which adhere to stones. By making frequent use of plants and other living beings, it is possible to gain a great deal from the spirit of the world." End quote. Precious stones, transformed into potions or worn as talismans, impress on the human spirit the qualities of the planets, protecting the organism from the plague and the effects of poisons, etc. It can be said that pneumatic purging is one of the themes constantly taken up by Synesius, but the Bishop of Cyrene does not go in depth into the theurgic procedures through which the purification is supposed to take place. These procedures can be found in a different context, that of the Chaldean oracles edited by Julian the Theurgist, son of Julian, called the Chaldean. In the second half of the 2nd century AD, partially preserved and commentated by the Neoplatonists and by the learned Byzantine Michael Psellos. Talismatic science, Psellos tells us in his commentary, is that which, so to speak, initiates the soul through the power of substances from here below, according to the Chaldean. We can only rise to God by strengthening the vehicle of the soul through material rites. Indeed, in his opinion, the soul is purified by stones, by herbs, by incantations, and this works well to bring about its ascension. The allusion to the vehicle of the soul does not refer to the authentic doctrine of the oracles. Psellos must have come upon it when frequenting Neoplatonist commentators. On the other hand, the ritual procedures for purifying the soul to make possible its theurgic elevation are truly expounded in the oracles. As we have seen, the theme of pneumatic purifications was already manifest in late Stoicism. The Stoics, taking their cue from Sicilian medicine, had worked out a rather complex etymology, through which they tried to give an empirical basis for their deep moral preoccupations. Hence, according to Epictetus, to be virtuous means having a calm pneuma, pure and transparent, and vice versa, the attainment of this clean and limpid cardiac mirror depends entirely on the individual's moral life. The purification of the heart through virtuous practices, as well as by use of efficacious sounds and other more or less magical procedures. It represents a very ancient preoccupation in the Orient. The Upanishads develop a subtle physiology based on the role of a cardiac synthesizer called Manas, whose existence was never in doubt according to any school of Indian philosophy, except perhaps for a few materialists. During sleep, the energies or pranas withdraw into the manas, or inner sense, a phenomenon called telescoping of pranas. In the waking state, they circulate in the subtle body. In mystic practices, the cavity of the heart, or ethereal cavity, the Akasha Hridaya, plays an essential part. Quote, "The little space in the heart is as big as this great universe. The heavens and the earth are there, the sun, the moon and the stars, fire and lightning, and winds are there also, and all that exists now, and all that exists no longer, for the whole universe is in him, and he lives in our heart." Unquote. It goes without saying that it is incumbent on the transparency of the Akasha Hridaya to recognise in the heart the practices of the divinity or of the intellect. A number of mystical practices, including the preliminary stages of yoga, have as their goal the purification of the subtle organism, the restoration of its original purity. The sin, or heart, is no less important in Taoism and in Chan Buddhism. Even when it is not named, it is understood that the Taoist finds the gods within a cavity of his own subtle organism, which answers to Akasha Hridaya. The procedures of visualization employed by the Taoist are analogous to those of yoga and of the Western art of memory. As for the Sufi mystic in Iran, he makes use of a number of procedures to obtain the cleansing of the heart, qalb, and the most important being the use of ritual formulas, zikr, or Persian mantras. In turn, the hesychastic mystic in Oriental Christianity is using a technique called cardioscopy, which consists in visualizing the space of the heart, cardia, in trying to restore it to all of its purity and transparency. He too makes use of one or more formulas and increasingly slow breathing rhythms, like the Yogin and the Taoist. We shall not dwell on those generalizations, for even a rough analysis of these basic problems of the history of religions would take up more space than can be given here. Can the conclusion be drawn that Indian philosophy is the source of all mystical speculations and techniques dealing with the heart? Though it cannot be excluded, such a conclusion is most unlikely. Humans react to external stimuli through emotions producing immediate secretions of adrenaline. Every external stimulus is accompanied by an internal impulse, which is experienced in the heart's sense. The earliest language, the verb, is a corporeal expression, and verbal schemata are the referentiality of all possible actions of Homo sapiens. Let us take some random verbal schemata relating to the heart. A person incapable of being touched by the suffering of another reveals hardness of heart, or has a heart of stone. On the other hand, someone who reacts appropriately to his emotions has a kind heart, and he who has no evil intent in his social behaviour, imagining that others have none either, has a pure heart. Another person has his heart in his mouth, wears it on his sleeve, has a heart of gold, but may also be heavy-hearted, faint-hearted, or sick at heart. It is possible to do things light-heartedly, or even wholeheartedly, but it may happen that we lack the heart to do anything. When we have set our heart on something, we want to clear the matter up. And youthfulness of heart means a fickle heart. As to love affairs, they lead us to offer or to refuse our heart, and so on. There must surely be an extra-linguistic truth in all these expressions, a truth which asserts that the heart is the seat of sensibility, of all emotional reactions, and is the preeminent moral or immoral organ. If the Englishman thinks with his head, there are people like the Manchurians who think with the heart. They are ill when their heart is shadowy, whereas healthy people have a transparent heart. S.M. Shiro Kogorov finds nothing strange in these concepts. Quote, "It must be recognized that the emotional perception of the shadowed being is altogether inadmissible, and that the concept of the heart as organ of the process of thought is entirely positivist, for thought in its emotional manifestations is perceived by the heart. According to the positivist point of view of Europeans, an effort is made to localize thought in particular sections of the brain, a naive conception of positivism based on various hypotheses that all depend on the idea of an abstract brain. Seen in this light, the European positivist point of view is not too far removed from that of the Manchurians, who have the right to speak of the localization of the thought process within the heart because they feel it so." End quote. Aristotle denied that it was possible to think without phantasms. Now, phantasms are coloured emotionally, and though they are able to occupy any space, the place that suits them best is the heart, for it is the heart that feels emotions. This bodily given, the real manifestation of emotional reactions in the space of the heart, includes the fact that several peoples of antiquity separately constructed analogous theories, such as that of the Manas of India and the Hegemonikon in Greece. Since it is impossible to deny that emotions have a concrete nature, it is also impossible to deny the existence of a place where they are made manifest, a place which corresponds more or less to the anatomical localization of the heart. In this localization there must lie the anthropological explanation of the genesis of the subtle organ called heart, which must be older than that of the discovery of the anatomical organ of the same name. As a screen for projection of internal phantasmagoria, the heart must very early have obsessed the human spirit. By identifying bodily energies with emotions, Indian philosophy and Greek medicine transformed the heart into a depository for both, into the principal organ of life and of communication with the outside world. As for visionary activity, it is easy to agree that it could only be localized where phantasms have a predilection for manifesting themselves, namely in the very center of the subtle organism. What about the head? We can still rely on the huge documentation put together by Richard Broxton O'Nions and by Anders Ollerud to form an idea about it. It seems that the dignity Plato confers on the human head in Timaeus rests on an intricate archaic problem differentiating two organs of consciousness: the heart, care or kradia, seat of the vegetative soul, thymos, and the head, seat of the psyche. To Anions, thymos is the blood soul, and psyche the breath soul. But the original difference between the two concepts must not have been noteworthy, since the word thymos is itself related to Indo-European vocables indicating vapour or breath, Latin fumus, Sanskrit dumar, Slavonic dimu and duku. As to the psyche, like the Latin animus, it too is preeminently a breath, since it derives from the verb psychein, to breathe, but its exclusive localization in the head is moot. On the contrary, in a whole complex of beliefs, the psyche represents all bodily respiration, being linked to the sperma, which is a genital respiration. It is in Platonic ontology and anthropology that there appears a precise differentiation between head and heart, plainly favouring the former. The human head, resembling a sphere, is in the image of the cosmos. The head is the outstanding microcosm, the body and its limbs are an appendage, or, as Plato himself says, the soul is a subordinate servant. In Timaeus, he emphasises that the soul lives in the head in exactly the same way as the soul of the world lives in the spherical cosmos. Plato adds, also in Timaeus, "For we are a plant, not earthly, but celestial." And indeed, it is from the top, the side where the original birth of the soul took place, that God suspended our head, which is like a root, and in the same way he gave our whole body erect posture. It is on account of this ontological polarization, expressed in terms relating to space, top versus bottom, which is simultaneously a moral polarization, good versus bad, that Plato postulates the doctrine of a tripartite soul, to which corresponds the tripartition of the human body into head, rational soul, breast or heart, irrational soul, and belly, appetitive soul. Considered by Plato to be entirely subordinate to the head, the heart is the seat of the emotions, but it is not predominantly the visionary organ, that role being attributed rather unexpectedly to the liver. Not until the Stoics were the relations between head and heart posited in a new way, so that virtues became associated with purity of heart. Renaissance magic derived from this concept, making the cleansing of the heart one of its main pursuits. The word theurgy sometimes designates purifications whose purpose is to restore to the pneuma its original transparency, fineness, and flexibility. Ficino's image of the theurgist, the practitioner of intersubjective magic, did not amount to enough to run counter to the customs of the time. Far from evoking the spirits of the dead like the necromancer described by Benvenuto Cellini, far from flying up into the air and casting a spell on men and beasts like traditional witches, even far from applying himself to pyrotechnics like Henricus Cornelius Agrippa, or to cryptography like Father Trithemius, Ficino's magician is an innocuous individual whose habits are neither reprehensible nor shocking in the eyes of a good Christian. We can be sure that if we look him up, unless he does not consider our company to be respectable, which is very likely, he will suggest that we accompany him on his daily walk. He will lead us surreptitiously to avoid undesirable encounters to an enchanted garden, a pleasant place where sunlight and the fresh air comes in contact only with the scent of flowers and pneumatic waves emanating from birdsong. Our theurgist, in his white wool gown of exemplary cleanliness, will perhaps apply himself to inhaling and exhaling air rhythmically. Then, having noticed a cloud, will anxiously go home afraid of catching cold. He will play the lyre to attract the beneficent influence of Apollo and the other divine graces, after which he will sit down to a frugal repast of some cooked vegetables and lettuce leaves, 2 rooster hearts to strengthen his own heart, and a sheep's brain to strengthen his own brain. The only luxury he will allow himself will be a few spoonfuls of white sugar and a glass of good wine, though on close examination this is mixed with an insoluble powder in which we can discern a ground amethyst, sure to draw upon him the favours of Venus. We shall notice that his house is as clean as his clothing, and that our theurgist will wash himself systematically once or twice a day, in contrast to most of his compatriots who do not have his good habits. We shall not be surprised that this individual, intent on bothering no one and who, into the bargain, was as clean as a cat, never aroused the anger of any authority, secular or religious. He was tolerated in proportion to his own tolerance, or rather indifference towards his less advanced fellows, whose pneuma was never as transparent as his own. Part 2. Intersubjective Magic. Intrasubjective magic is only a special case of intersubjective magic, which functions according to the principle of the continuity of the universal pneuma. Wording of this principle changes little from Synesius to Ficino. Let us listen to this. Quote, "No one should think that, through the use of certain earthly substances, it is possible to attract the presence of numinous entities that appear immediately. On the contrary, what is attracted are demons, or rather potius, gifts of the animate world and of the living stars. May it not be thought either that it is possible to bewitch, aleci, the soul by means of material things, for it is the universal soul itself that makes the bait, escas, that suits the soul, and with which it can be bewitched, and it stays there willingly. For there is nothing in the living world that is so deformed as not to possess a soul, or likewise its gifts. Zoroaster designated these affinities of forms to the reasoning faculty of the universal soul by the term divine enticements, divinas illicis, and Synesius corroborated their quality of magic charms, magicas illacibras. Many people aver that magic is a technique that allows men to attract at favourable times celestial presences through lower things corresponding to higher things." End quote. These two passages require some clarification. Ficino states that the universal soul is itself the source of all magic because, in its freedom, it has chosen to create affinities between the higher and lower worlds. By virtue of this principle, there are certain objects with which it is possible to invoke higher presences, and tradition has named them baits, decoys, lures, enticements, charms, seductions, etc. Thus it is possible to translate the words esca, ilex, illiciber. The soul itself, in its goodness, has created the possibility in certain circumstances of surrendering itself to the wise man who is aware of the use of these objects. Nature exists so that man may use it. It is as though the fish itself, by wishing to feed man, taught him how to make the fish hook. Ficino's definition of magic is concise and clear. The purpose of magical manoeuvres is to obtain far-off results by means of immediate causes, especially action upon higher things by the lower things that are their affinity, per inferiora consentinea, and thus serve as lures, escae, illices, illicibrae, enticing them, alici, at favourable times, temporibus opportunis. He speaks, to be more precise, of a transitive mechanism which, at first, puts in motion physical causes in order to obtain hyperphysical results. In turn, the results are changed into new causes which produce new results of a physical kind. In order to form a clear idea of these manoeuvres, we must analyse the meaning of these three components that constitute the operation of magic seduction, alici. The higher presences, superiora, the lower things that are their affinities, or get on well with them, inferiora consentinea, or lures, escae, illices, illicibrae, and the suitable times, tempora opportuna. Higher presences. What has attracted our demons, or rather, gifts of the animate world and the living stars? Sed daemones potius animataque mundi munera stellarum quae viventium, says Ficino in the first chapter of his treatise De Vita Coelitus Comparanda. A synthetic but exhaustive turn of phrase to describe the kind of aids the magician expects to obtain. The next chapter of this book will, in large part, be devoted to the various categories of demons, noimatic beings between the worlds. It remains for us to define here gifts of the animate world and gifts of the living stars. The gifts of the animate world are the natural recipients of noima, which have the property of feeding the human spirit by virtue of the law of noimatic solidarity of cosmic parts. A long quote here. We can incorporate more and more of quinta essentia by knowing how to isolate the elementary compounds of which it is a part, or by making frequent use of those things that abound mostly in spirit of a high degree of purity, such as noble wine, sugar, balsam, gold, precious stones, myrobalan, the things that have the sweetest perfumes and things that are shiny. In the same way, through frequent use of plants and other living things, it is possible to draw a great deal from the cosmic spirit. If one desires that a food take hold of the brain, rapiat prae ceteris formin cerebri tui, that is, that it have influence upon the brain, etc., the liver and the stomach, one must eat as much as one can of the brain, liver and stomach of animals that are not far removed from human nature. Mammals, probably, but not exclusively. End quote. But the main part of Ficino's work is devoted to the description of gifts from the living stars, munera stellarum viventium. We shall confine ourselves to expounding the fundamental principles of astromagic without going into detail. Astrologers, called Platonic philosophers by Ficino out of respect for tradition, have established celestial universal figures which, in their parts, contain the varieties of all lower things. There are 12 signs and 36 decans in the zodiac, making a total of 48 universals figurae, universales figurae, to which are added 360 more, according to the number of degrees in the zodiacal circle. These figurae make up the space in which the 7 planets revolve, determining their aspects. The gifts of the living stars are the properties peculiar to the planets according to their respective positions, in other words, according to propitious times, tempora opportuna. Since the human body is an image of the physical cosmos, each of the 7 planets has a particular influence. These affinities, called astral melothesia, form a nucleus of the doctrine expounded in the Iatro Mathematica attributed to Hermes Trismegistus. Soli oculus dexter lunae sinister, Saturno auditus auresque Iovi cerebrum, cruor sanguisque Marti, Venerae olfactus gustaque, Mercurio lingua et Gurgulio. This is the theoretical principle underlying the construction of homines flebitomici, or the images which show exactly the influence of the planets, the signs and the decans on the human body. In reality, since planets, signs and decans sometimes form very complicated combinations, it is necessary to draw up a new list of affinities for almost every planetary position and to construct a new phlebotomic man. The remedies of iatromathematics entirely depend on the exact composition of the above to determine, by reason of the planets and signs that govern a certain part of the body at a certain time, the use of the appropriate medicinal herbs. Quote, in order to know the fate of a sick person, if not to cure him, strange calculating machines are still used, deriving from astrological data. For example, the one from the sphere of Petosiris, invented in the 1st century AD, according to Boll. In order to treat the person, it is essential to remember that, according to the Greek principle of melothesia, his anatomy and his physiology are governed by the stars. Each sign of the zodiac rules a part of the body. Each planet reigns over an organ. A surgeon cannot operate on a diseased limb if the moon is in the sign of the zodiac responsible for that limb, or else the humidity of the planet would cause the most serious complications to ensue at once." End quote. In the 5th chapter of his Vita Coelitus Comparanda, Ficino describes the doctrine of astral melothesia, and in the 6th and 10th chapters he deals with the principle of phlebotomic man, but without going into detail. Comparing the space he gives this subject with the learned construct of a real iatro-mathematician like Johannes of Hausfurt, we can conclude that it is a marginal though indispensable element in the sum total of Ficino's magic. Indeed, Ficino is most preoccupied not with curing body illnesses, but with the purification of the spirit and the spiritual advantages that the practitioner can draw from the position of the planets. Let us remember that the 3 of the 7 planets that Ficino calls the 3 graces, the Sun, Jupiter and Venus, are beneficent. Mars and Saturn are malefic, whereas Mercury veers between one group and the other. How can the qualities of the beneficent planets be drawn to the individual Neuma? Quote, "If you wish to imbue your body and spirit with the qualities of one of the members of the cosmos," the word membrum means to Ficino organ, for example of the sun, look for things that are preeminently solar among metals and stones, and more among plants, and even more among animals, and most of all among men. There follows a list of solar metals, stones, plants, animals, and men. Likewise, if you wish to impregnate your body with the virtue of Jupiter, move your body to the day and hour of Jupiter, under the domination of Jupiter. Squeeze yourself between all things that belong to Jupiter. Another list. As the qualities of Venus, they can be attracted by turtle doves, pigeons, and wagtails, and also by other things that modesty forbids us to reveal. End quote. Depending on the kind of activity to be stimulated, all the planets are equally important. Saturn has charge of higher philosophy and occultism, Jupiter of natural philosophy and politics, Mars of virile curtamina, the Sun and Mercury of eloquence, music and glory, Venus of festivities, and the Moon of nourishment. The influence of the planets over the parts of our body determines the kind of astrological remedies that should be applied, depending on the case. Pharmacology, moreover, is one of the most important branches of magic. To summarize all the above concisely, res naturales atque etiam artificiosiae habent virtutes a stellos occultas, per quas spiritum nostrum stellos aestem exponunt. Natural things, as well as artificial things, have occult qualities conferred upon them by the stars. Through these things our spirit attracts the influence of the respective stars. The lures. The purpose of Ficino's Neumatic magic is to improve the spiritual, physical, psychic, and social conditions of the magician himself or his client. Theurgy and medicine are the magician's principal activities. Plants, stones, metals, and the various other substances used according to the position of the planets in the zodiac exert a positive influence upon the spirit of the theurgist and upon an invalid's health. Amulets, talismans, and images, depending on the case, can have a prophylactic or curative effect. It goes without saying that the same remedies can be used to obtain results of a different kind: social success, learning facility, practicing a profession, harmony in intersubjective relations, etc. It is easy to imagine that for every undertaking there is a lucky position of the stars and a method of making use of it. As for Ficino himself, his main interest is directed towards theurgy and iatromathematics. The arsenal of magic is made up of a series of substances which are in touch with the planets in a certain way. Their use can be direct or indirect. In the first instance, it can be a matter of simple potions or talismans. In the second, a matter of more complex objects produced according to propitious times to store up the beneficent influence of a certain configuration of the chart of the heavens. One attributes a quality of sometimes miraculous kind to the astrological images made of metals and stones. Quote, "The use of talismans does not contravene free will. Albert the Great, in his Speculum, says that free will is not limited by choice of a propitious time, but rather by holding in contempt the choice of a propitious time for beginning great ventures. One gives no proof of freedom. On the contrary, one only overturns free will." Ptolemy says in his Couliano that the images of lower things are exposed to many celestial images. That is why the wise men of antiquity were accustomed to fabricating certain images when the planets entered constellations which were almost the model of terrestrial things. End quote. We shall not here take up the doctrine of images expounded by Ficino according to Hermetic, Neoplatonic, and Arab sources. We already know that each planet is attached to a whole series of things on Earth. These make up the primary matter for the manufacture of astrological talismans. In any case, Ficino attributes to them qualities inferior to those of remedies and ointments. Propitious times. The tempora opportuna for picking a medicinal herb or for making a potion or a talisman depend entirely on the position of the planets in the zodiac and in the celestial houses. The preparations for these astrological manoeuvres are of a degree of complexity varying according to the case. From the most simple to the most sophisticated, they all correspond to the same principle enunciated above. One example will suffice. Quote, "To gain a long life, they fabricated the image of the aged Saturn in stone of Ferzech, that is to say, sapphire, at the time of Saturn ascending, and in propitious relation to the rest of the sky. The form it took was thus: an old man seated on a raised throne or on a dragon, his head covered with a cloth of dark-coloured linen, his arm upraised, fish or a weight in his hand, and dressed in a tunic also dark in colour." End quote. Images of this kind are mostly borrowed from the Picatrix. They correspond to planets and to personified entities of the zodiac, signs, decans, stages, whose invention the Picatrix attributes to the Indians. Again, one example will suffice to show the affinities between the two kinds of depiction. Quote, "In the first aspect of Eros, a man rises with red eyes, a big long beard draped in white linen, walking with huge strides, girded with a red sash on a red costume, standing on one foot as though looking at what lies before him." End quote. These descriptions were probably meant to be incorporated into the magician's fantasy when he prayed to the planets. The planetary orations in the Picatrix, moreover, contain an enumeration of qualities attributed to the respective planets, undoubtedly delivered by the magician with his eyes fixed on the internal image of the sidereal divinity. Quote, "O Master, whose name is hallowed and whose power is great, Supreme Master, O Master Saturn, thou the cold, the sterile, the bleak and the baleful, thou whose life is sincere and whose word is truth, thou the wise and the solitary, thou the impenetrable, thou who keepest promises, thou who art weak and weary, thou who hast more cares than anyone, thou who knowest neither pleasure nor joy, sly old man who knowest all ruses, thou who art deceiver, wise and sensible, who bringest prosperity or ruin, and who makest man happy or miserable, I beg you, O Supreme Father, through thy great benevolence and generous goodness, do this and that for me." End quote. It is easy to judge how closely related were magic properly so called, the art of memory and glyptics. Talismans were supposed to represent personified entities of the zodiac that the magician had memorized and impressed on his fantasy to be directed towards all useful ends. Every invocation of the entities was to be accompanied by instantaneous visualization of them, endowed with autonomous existence and actually appearing in the pneumatic apparatus of the trained magician. In the last analysis, these strange personages are none other than the renowned demons inhabiting all zones of the cosmos.